Hello, and welcome back to Alison's History of Europe. For those of you who are about to listen, I just wanted to give you a bit of a warning. I tended to stutter a lot through this recording. I had headphones on over the top, so I couldn't really hear how I was pronouncing things, and as a result, it's pretty messy. If you want to bear with it and listen to it, go ahead. If not, I'm sure in a few weeks I'll come back to this episode and reread it. Thank you for those who do. Thank you for those who don't. Enjoy, if you can, the part that I've got. Thank you. The introduction continued from 31. But the feudal liberty was at length destroyed by the change of manners and the natural progress of opulence. Being confined to a limited class of society, it expired with the virtue of those who alone were interested in its defence. Conferring little upon the great body of the people, it derived nothing from the talents which lay buried amongst them. Wealth enervated its possessors, and no inferior class existed to supply their place. The rich became corrupted, while the poor did not cease to be slaves. The progress was different in different states, but in all the result was the same. The kingdoms both of Aragon and Castile were governed, in their early history, by more limited monarchs than the Plantagenets of England, and their nobles did not yield to the barons of Runnymede in zeal for the preservation of their privileges. But it was in vain that they extorted concessions from their sovereigns, and confirmed them on occasion of every renewal of the coronation oath. The spirit of freedom, and with it the liberties of the nation, died away upon the decay of the feudal aristocracy, from the selfishness and degradation of the great body of the people. When Charles V had suppressed, in 1548, the formidable revolt of the Comuneros, he excluded not the deputies of the cities and boroughs, but of the grandees and prelates from the representation, and the result showed that he knew human nature well when he did so. Deprived of their natural leaders, the commons were never afterwards able to resist the authority of government. The Cortes maintained its nominal rights, and the great privilege, the Magna Carta of Aragon, was never repealed, but the cities neglected sending representatives to the assemblies, and many suffered their right to a place in its deliberations to fall into abeyance. The nobles, cut off from political power, became attached to the splendour of a court, and, with the forms of a limited, Spain became a despotic monarchy. In France, the nobility, during the period of their feudal vigour, reduced the crown to nearly the same limited sway as prevailed in England, insomuch that, for nearly half a century, it was a general opinion, confirmed by several solemn acts of the throne, that no tax could be levied without the consent of the three estates. But the skeleton of a free government perished with the decay of feudal manners. The influence of the crown and the attractions of a metropolis drew the nobility to Paris, and liberty in the country, deprived of its only supporters, speedily fell to the ground. The progress was somewhat different in Germany, although there, as elsewhere in the European monarchies, the feudal system at first established the illegality of taxes without the consent of the people, and the sharing of the legislative sovereignty with the states of the kingdom. The power of the greatest barons rendered the empire elective, and broke down into separate states the venerable fabric of the German Confederacy. But their sway within their own domains, being not restrained by the vigour or intelligence of the people, gradually became unlimited, and the restraints of liberty were obliterated in the rising ambition of military power. Notwithstanding the long and hereditary attachment of the English people to free institutions, notwithstanding the diffusion of this spirit by the establishment of trial by jury, and its preservation by the protection of its insular situation, the usual causes of decline had begun to operate, and the feudal independence of the barons in the Middle Ages yielded to the corrupted subservience of opulent times. The desolating wars of York and Lancaster thinned the ranks of the nobles. The increase of luxury, by changing the direction of their expenditure, sapped the foundations of their power. Under the Tudor princes, the indifference of Parliament to the liberties of the people had already commenced. Europe could not exhibit a monarch who governed his people with more absolute sway than Henry VIII, nor is anything in modern times more instructive than the pliant civility with which both the Parliament and the people obeyed his despotic commands. History can hardly exhibit an example of a reign in which a greater number of violent invasions were made, not only on public rights, but on private property, in which justice was more disgracefully prostituted in the courts of law, liberty more completely abandoned in the proceedings of Parliament, or caprice more tyrannically exerted on the throne. Those who ascribe the freedom of England solely to the feudal institutions would do well to consider the conditions of the country, the pliancy of the legislature, and the civility of the people during the reign of this ferocious tyrant, who confiscated the property of 1/3 of the landholders of his kingdom, and executed 72,000 persons in his single lifetime, or even perhaps during that of his more prudent and popular daughter. Admirably adapted, therefore, as the feudal system was for preserving an independent spirit during the Middle Ages, gratefully as we must acknowledge its influence in restraining the power of the northern conquerors, and preventing the very name of right or privilege from being swept away, as in the Asiatic monarchies, by the desolating hands of power, fully as we must admit that tyranny would have rioted without control, if, when the people were poor and disunited, the nobles had not been brave and free. Still, it is obvious that it was an institution suited only to a barbarous age, and alike incapable of being moulded according to the changes which society undergoes, or of providing for the freedom of civilized times. With the institution of standing armies, the progress of luxury, the invention of gunpowder, and the rise of cities, it necessarily decayed. The liberty which was built on no other foundation than the feudal institutions has everywhere long since fallen to the ground. That system was in its vigour during the 12th and 13th centuries, when the barons dwelt in fortified castles on their estates, surrounded by a tenantry trained to warlike exercises, and attached alike by habit and interest to the fortunes of their chief, cased in armour from head to foot, and leading on a body of warlike and devoted retainers. They were alike formidable to the throne and oppressive to the cottage. If they extorted privileges in their own favour from the sovereign, they gave none to their enslaved vassals. With a merciless hand and unsparing severity, they checked the first struggles of the people for a share of that freedom which they so strenuously asserted for themselves. The insurrections of the Jacquerie in France, of the peasants under Wat Tyler in England, and of the Flemings under Brewer of Ghent, were repressed with a cruelty of which history affords few examples. The courage and enthusiasm of the multitude in vain contended for victory against steel-clad warriors trained to arms from their earliest years. The knights broke through the ranks of the peasants with the same ease as they would have traversed an unarmed assembly, and the degraded serf, incapable of those efforts of heroism which animated the free shepherds of the Alps, sank beneath the stroke of fate with the resignation of a martyr rather than the spirit of a warrior. But the power of the nobles, incapable of being subverted by force, was undermined by opulence, and the emancipation of the people, from which so many thousands had perished in vain, arose at length through the desires and follies of their oppressors. The baron was formidable when his life was spent in arms, and when he headed the feudal array which had grown up under the shadow of his castle walls. When his years were wasted in the frivolities of a court, his ambition centred in the smiles of a sovereign, and his fortune was squandered in the luxuries of a metropolis, he became contemptible. His tenantry ceased either to venerate or follow a chief whom they seldom beheld. The seductions of cities became omnipotent to those who no longer valued their rural dependence. The desires of wealth insatiable among persons who had the glittering prospect of a court before their eyes. The natural progress of opulence by withdrawing the nobles from the seat at once of their usefulness and their influence, proved fatal to a power which made no provision for general felicity, and the wisdom of nature rendered the follies of the great the means of destroying the power which they had rendered the instrument of oppression instead of the bulwark of freedom. While this was the fate of the liberty which the barbarian conquerors of the Roman Empire brought with them from their native wilds, the progress of events was different in the south of Europe, where the ancient traces of Roman civilization had never been wholly extirpated, and the wild shoots of Gothic freedom had never fully expanded. The liberty of modern Italy did not spring from the independence of the landed proprietors, but the free spirit of the inhabitants of towns. Its cradle was the workshop, not the tent; the centre of its power, the turbulent forum, not the baronial hall. While the great landowners were engaged in projects of mutual slaughter, and issued only from their fastness in the Apennines to ravage the plains below, the inhabitants of the towns flourished under the protection of their native ramparts, and revived on their ancient hearths the decaying embers of urban liberty. At a time when the Transalpine states were still immersed in barbarism, and industry was beginning only to spring in sheltered situations under the shadows of the castle wall, the Italian republics were already far advanced in opulence, and the arts had struck a deep root amidst the monuments of ancient splendour. The age of Edward I of England, when the nobles of that country were still living in rustic plenty on their estates, when rushes were spread on the floors instead of carpets, and few of the barons could sign their name, was contemporary with that of Dante in Italy, with the conceptions of Bramante and the fancy of Boccaccio. The genius of Raphael and the thoughts of Machiavelli were not far removed in point of time from the frightful devastations of the English bands in France, and the unutterable horrors of the Jacquerie Rebellion. When Charles VIII, at the head of the brave but barbarous nobility of France, burst into Italy at the close of the 15th century, he found himself in the midst of an opulent and highly civilized people, far advanced in the career of improvement, and abounding in merchants who numbered all the sovereigns of Europe among their debtors. When the feudal chieftain threatened to blow his trumpets within the walls of Florence, her citizens declared that they would sound the tocsin, and the monarch of the greatest military kingdom of Europe shrank from a contest with the burghers of a pacific republic. Nor were the civil virtues of this period of Italian greatness less remarkable than its opulence and splendour. So early as the 12th century, the Emperor of Germany was defeated by a coalition of the republics of Lombardy, and the virtues of the Grecan states were rivaled by the patriotism of modern freedom. History has to record with pride that, when the inhuman cruelty of the German soldiery placed the children of the citizens of Crema before the walls of the cities, to deter the besieged from discharging their weapons, their parents wept aloud, but did not cease to combat for their liberties, and that, when 11,000 of the first citizens of Pisa were confined to the prisons of Genoa, they sent a unanimous request to the Senate not to purchase their freedom by the surrender of one fortress in the hands of the Republic. The naval wars of Genoa and Venice want only historians as graphic as Livy or Thucydides to render them as celebrated in story, as they were as fertile in heroic actions, as those of Athens and Sparta, of Rome and Carthage. We speak with exultation of the efforts made by the British Empire during the late war, but how great soever, they must yield in comparison with the exertions of Italian patriotism, which manned the rival fleets of Genoa and Pisa with as many sailors at the Battle of La Migliora as served the navies of England and France at Trafalgar. But the republics of Italy yielded to the influence of the same causes which had proved so pernicious to the Grecan commonwealths, and destroyed the feudal independence of the north of Europe. They made no provision for the liberties or interests of the great body of the people. The states of Florence, Venice, Genoa, and Pisa were not in reality free. They were communities in which a few individuals had usurped the rights and disposed of the fortunes of the great bulk of their fellow citizens, whom they governed as subjects or insulted as slaves. During the most flourishing period of their history, The citizens of all the Italian republics did not amount to 20,000, and these privileged classes held as many millions in subjection. The citizens of Venice were 2,500, those of Genoa 4,500, those of Pisa, Siena, Lucca, Florence, taken together, not above 6,000. The right of citizenship, thus limited, descended in a few families, and was as carefully guarded from invasion as the private estates of the nobility. To the conquered provinces no privileges were extended. To the republics in alliance no rights were communicated. A rigid system at once of political and mercenary exclusion directed their whole policy. The privileged classes in the dominant state anxiously retained the whole powers of government in their own hands, and the jealous spirit of mercantile monopoly ruled the fortunes of the state as much as it cramped the industrial energies of the subjected territory. From freedom thus confined, no general benefit could be expected. On a basis thus narrowed, no structure of permanent duration could be raised. Even during their greatest prosperity, these states were disgraced by perpetual discord, springing from so unjust and arbitrary an exclusion. And the massy architecture of Florence still attests the period when every noble family was prepared to stand a siege in their own palace, in defence of the rights which they sternly denied to their fellow citizens. The rapid progress and splendid history of these aristocratic republics may teach us the animating influence of freedom, even upon a limited class of society. Their sudden decline and speedy loss of public spirit, the inevitable consequence of confining to a few the rights which should be shared by a larger circle, and governing in the narrow spirit of mercantile monopoly, not the enlarged views of equal administration. Republics thus constituted were unable either to withstand the shocks of adverse, or resist the silent decay consequent upon prosperous fortune. The first great disaster stripped the selfish state of all its allies, and reduced it to the force that were to be found within its own walls. The Venetian oligarchy gave no rights to the conquered provinces of the Trevisan March, though the Senate announced in sending the standard of St. Mark, it restored their liberties, and accordingly in one day Venice was stripped of all its possessions, and reduced to its original limits within the lagunae of the capital. When Florence reduced the rival Republic of Pisa, she received no additional strength, because she gave no community of advantages, and the troops employed to keep the conquered state in subjection were so much lost to the victorious power. The dissolution of the Athenian confederacy after the defeat before Syracuse, of the Lacedaemonian power after the battle of Leuctra, of the Theban supremacy after the battle of Epaminondas, have all their counterparts in the history of modern Italy, when, on any serious reverse to Venice, Florence, or Genoa, the cities of which they formed the head broke off from a subjection which they hated, and joined the arms of any invader to destroy that invidious authority in which they were not permitted to bear a part. Without the disasters of fortune, the silent operation of time brought the weakness of age upon communities which depended only upon the energies of the higher classes. The families in whose hands the sovereign power was vested became extinct from age, or enfeebled by opulence, and no infusion of vigour from the inferior orders took place to restore their energy. The number of citizens continually declined, while the discontents of those subjects to their influence incessantly increased. The experienced evils arising from such a form of government led to a very general dislike of its continuance, and to avoid the ruinous contests of factions, as many of the Italian republics made a voluntary surrender of their liberties, as lost them from the invasion of foreign power. The industry and wealth of Flanders early nourished a free spirit, and the utmost efforts were long made by the inhabitants of its cities for the maintenance of their liberties. The effects of these efforts were immense. They converted arid sands into fertile fields, and overspread the land with numerous and opulent cities. They rendered Brabant the garden of Europe, the object alike of monarch's envy and of nations' ambition. But its freedom was confined to the burghers of the towns, The peasantry of the country joined their feudal leaders in combating the rising influence of the manufacturing classes, and the jealousies of rival industry generally prevented the inhabitants from joining in any common measure for the defence of their independence. Once only an unhoped-for victory roused the whole country to arms, and a leader of greater military experience might have established their freedoms on a durable basis. But the burghers of Kent had not the firmness of the shepherds of Underwalden, and the victory of Resbeck crushed for centuries the rising independence of commercial industry under the barbarous yoke of feudal power. Experience, therefore, had demonstrated that the freedom which arose from the independence of the desert, equally with that which was nursed in the bosom of the cities, was liable to decay, and that political wisdom was incapable of forming a community in which the seeds of that decline were not perceptible, which seemed the common lot of earthly things. It became in consequence a generally received opinion that nations, like individuals, had a certain length of life allotted to them, which it was impossible by any means to extend beyond the destined period, and that a season of activity and vigour was necessarily followed by one of lassitude and corruption. The image, says Mr. Ferguson, of youth and old age was applied to nations, and communities, like single men, were supposed to have a period of life and a length of thread which was spun by the fates, in one part uniform and strong, in another weakened and shattered by use, to be cut when the destined error is come, and to make way for a renewal of the emblem in the case of those who rose in succession. Carthage, says Polybius, being so much older than Rome, had felt her decay so much the sooner, and the survivor too he foresaw carried in her bosom the seeds of mortality. But while such was imagined, from former experience, to be the unavoidable fate of freedom, wherever established, a variety of causes were silently operating, which communicated an unknown energy to the social system, and infused into modern states, even in periods of apparent decline, a large intermixture of the undecaying youth of the human race. The first of these was the Christian religion. Slavery had been the ruin of all the states of antiquity. The influence of wealth corrupted the higher orders, and the lower, separated by a sullen line of demarcation from their superiors, furnished no accession of strength to revive their energies. But the influence of religion, which proclaimed the universal equality of mankind in the sight of heaven, and addressed its revelations in an especial manner to the poor, destroyed this ruinous distinction. In many states, slavery gradually yielded to the rising influence of Christianity. The religious houses, which were the first who emancipated their vassals, their exhortations were unceasingly directed to extort the same concession from the feudal barons. They were often unsuccessful during life, but more frequently succeeded on the approach of death. Human selfishness was more willing to purchase eternal salvation by imposing a loss on others than by bearing it itself. On the ecclesiastical estates themselves, the first shoots of industrious freedom began to spring, while the vassals of the military proprietors were sunk in slavery, or lost in the sloth which follows so degraded a state. Industry was reviving under the shadow of the monastic walls, and the free vassals of the religious establishments were flourishing in the comparative security of their protection. Modern historians, living in an age when the shield of superstition was no longer required, and its influence unfelt, have erred immensely in their estimate of its importance at an earlier and in a more unhappy period. They forgot that when reason is in its infancy, passion predominant, and ignorance universal, it is by images addressed to the senses alone that violence can be restrained, innocence protected, or the supremacy of mental over physical strength asserted. But if we go back in imagination to the sanguinary passions and universal bloodshed of the Dark Ages, we shall feel the value of any influences, how strange soever in the eyes of enlightened reason, which restrained the excesses of power when no other means of coercing it existed, which made the baron tremble before the spiritual, and therefore unseen power, even in the midst of his armed bands, and secured that protection to industry under the shadow of the monastery's cross, which it would have sought in vain beneath the shelter of a castle wall. The clearest proof of the truth of these principles, and of the incalculable influence which the superstitions, wisely inculcated in a barbarous age by the Roman Church, had in checking the devastation of the Norman conquest, and putting a curb on the violence of power when no other means of checking its excesses existed, is to be found in the wide difference between the settlements of the northern conquerors in Asia and in Europe. Philosophers are never wary of expatiating on the extraordinary influence between the civilization in these two quarters of the globe, on the restraints on tyranny which exist in the latter, while they are unknown in the former, and the vast development of mental power and social happiness which has taken place amidst European freedom, compared to what obtains under Eastern despotism. They would do well to consider to what cause this remarkable difference is to really be ascribed. The race of conquerors who overran both was originally sprung from the same root. The Cymry, who first planted their race in the British Isles, and who have given their lasting appellation to the western mountain ranges of Britain, were a branch of the same horde as the, this is in Greek, Chimexoi, whom Herodotus mentions as appearing with the first dawn of history on the shores of the Bosphorus, and a part of whose descendants afterwards perished by the legions of Marius. The Gauls spread themselves over France, Britain, Lombardy, and Greece. Their conquering arms gave a lasting appellation to a province of Asia, Galatia, that is, and it was their swords, more even than the Numidian horse, which so long enabled Hannibal, without aid from Carthage, to make head against the Roman power. Well, there you go. I had no idea that Hannibal was helped by the Gauls. The Goths and Huns, whose descendants have formed the most powerful nations of modern times, originally migrated from the wilds of Tartary, and the first impulse was given to the wave of barbarians which overthrew the Roman Empire by the defeats which the Scythians had sustained on the frontiers of China. The climate of Europe does not vary from that of similar latitude in Asia, except in the greater heat in summer and cold in winter, arising from the difference between an inland and maritime situation. How, then, has it happened that the same conquerors, subduing and settling in substantially the same physical circumstances, should have given birth to nations so essentially and diametrically opposite as those of Europe and Asia? Why have freedom and knowledge been sheltered from the lances of the one, and both invariably perished from the earliest times under the sabres of the other? And whence is it that the same corruption, which has so speedily in every age consumed or enfeebled the descendants of Asiatic conquest, has, after the lapse of 1,000 years, still made comparatively little impression on the offspring of the Gothic offspring of Gothic invasion? Simply because the religion of the two quarters of the globe in which the same conquerors settled was different, because polygamy has not in Europe spread its jealousies, nor the harem its seductions, because superstitious belief in barbarous times restrained power by imaginary terrors, and Christian charity, in civilized, assuaged suffering by real blessings, because slavery has generally disappeared before the proclaimed equality of men, and a perpetual renovation being thus provided to the richer classes, because war has been softened by the humanity breathed into the conflicts, because learning, sheltered under the sanctuary of the monastery, has survived the devastation of ignorance, and freedom, nursed by devotion, has acquired a strength superior to all the forces of despotism. It was not only the equality which it proclaimed, and the security from violence which it afforded, that the influence of religion favoured the growth of freedom. By the enthusiasm which it awakened, from the universal interests which it addressed, the mass of the people were called into political activity. Thousands, to whom the blessings of liberty were unknown, and whose torpor no temporal concerns could dispel, were roused by the voice of religious fervour. The freedom of Greece, the discipline of Macedonia, produced only a transient impression on human affairs, but the fanaticism of Muhammad convulsed the globe. The ardour of chivalry led the nobles into action. The ambition of monarchs brought the feudal retainers into the field, but the enthusiasm of the Crusades awakened the dormant strength of the Western world. With the growth of religious zeal, therefore, the basis of freedom was immensely extended. Into its ranks were brought, not the transient ebullitions of popular excitement, but the stern valour of fanaticism, and that lasting support which neither the ardour of the city nor the independence of the desert could afford, was at length drawn from the further of the cottage. While the minds of men were thus warmed by religious enthusiasm, which was awakened first by the Crusades and subsequently by the Reformation, the art of printing, destined to change the face of the moral world, perpetuated the impressions thus created and widened the circle over which they extended. The spirit of religious freedom was no longer nourished only from the exhortations of the pulpit, or developed in the fervour of secluded congregations. It breathed into the permanent exertions of human thought, and spread with the increasing wealth and enlarged desires of an opulent state of society. The discoveries of science, the charms of genius, may attract a few in every age, but it is by religious emotion that the great body of mankind are chiefly to be moved, and it was by the diffusion of its enthusiasm, accordingly, that the greatest efforts of European liberty have been sustained. But the diffusion of knowledge, by means of the press, is not destined to awake mere transient bursts of popular feeling. By imbuing the minds of those master spirits who direct human thought, it produces lasting impressions on society, and is perpetually renewed in the successive generations who inhale, during the ardour of youth, the maxims and the spirit of classical freedom. The whole face of society has been modified by this mighty discovery. The causes of ancient decay seem counteracted in a powerful manner by new principles of vitality, derived from the multitudes whose talents are brought to bear on the fortunes of the state, and the influence of despotic power shaken by the infusion of independent principles even into the armies which are destined to enforce its authority. But it is not unmixed good which has arisen from the diffusion of knowledge. If the principles of improvement have acquired a hardier growth, those of evil have more generally disseminated. The contests of society have grown in magnitude and increased in violence, and the passions of nations have been brought into collision instead of the ambition of individuals. Vice has here, as elsewhere in human affairs, fearfully put forth its influence to mar the benefits of this great discovery, and continued in the most advanced ages that struggle between virtue and sin, which has been the lot of man from the beginning of the world. The visions of inexperience, the dreams of philanthropy, at first anticipated the entire extirpation of evil from the extension of knowledge, and an unbroken progress of improvement from the spread of education, forgetting that the heart is the foundation from which the issues of life, the direction given to the acquisitions of science, flow, and that unless it is purified, it is of little moment what is put into the head. In the midst of these entrancing prospects, human iniquity mingled with the current. The new powers thus acquired were too often applied to the basest purposes. Crime and corruption increased with the extension of desires, and vice multiplied with the enlarged means of encompassing its ends, which instruction had afforded. It is to a general appreciation of this bitter but wholesome truth that mankind are at length awakening, after the enchanting dreams which were followed by the dreadful nightmare of the French Revolution. Yet while experience has now demonstrated the utter fallacy of all expectation of increased individual virtue, of augmented social felicity from mere intellectual cultivation, it is far from discouraging more cheering prospects of the ultimate effect of moral elevation and spiritual enjoyment on the race of man. Vice is generally victorious over virtue in the outset, but it is as often vanquished by it in the end. The pleasures of sin are at first fearfully alluring, its passions vehement, its gratifications intense. But both lead to disappointment and satiety. The beautiful image of the poet, quote, "a moment white, then lost forever," is true, not merely of sensual, but of all merely worldly enjoyment. Nothing permanent floats down the stream of time but what is buoyant from its elevating tendency. In the progress of ages, the most injurious elements of human affairs are gradually extinguished, while the causes of the improvements are lasting in their effects. The contests of the Greek republics, the cruelty of the Athenian democracy, have long ceased to trouble the world, but the maxims of Grecian virtue, the works of Grecian genius, the charms of Grecian art, will permanently continue to elevate mankind. The turbulence, the insecurity, the convulsions to which the extension of knowledge to the lower orders has hitherto given rise, will in time be forgotten. But the improved fabric of society which it has induced, the increased vigour which it has communicated, may ultimately compensate all its evils, and permanently bless and improve the species. But it would have been in vain that the influence of religion weakened the bonds of slavery, and the extension of knowledge enlarged the capacity of freemen, had no change occurred in the arms, by which the different classes of the society combat each other. While the aristocracy of the country were permanently trained to combats, and the robber chivalry was incessantly occupied in devastation, the peaceable inhabitants of cities, the rude labourers of the fields, were unable to resist their attacks. With the exception of the shepherds of the Alps, whose hardy habits early gave their infantry the firmness and discipline of veteran soldiers, the tumultuary levies of the people were, during the Middle Ages, everywhere crushed by the steel-clad bands of the feudal nobility. The insurrections of the commons in France, of the peasants in the time of Richard II in England, of the citizens of Ghent and Liege in Flanders, and of the serfs in Germany, were all suppressed by the superior arms and steadier discipline of the rival chivalry. But with the discovery of gunpowder, this decisive supremacy was destroyed. The feudal array, invincible to the spears or halberts of the peasantry, yielded to the terrible powers of artillery. Defensive armour was abandoned, from a sense of its insufficiency against this invisible assailant, and the weight of the aristocracy was destroyed by the experienced inability of its forces to combat the discipline which laborious industry could bring into the field. The wealth of Flanders in vain contended with the lances of France on the field of Rysbeck, but the armies of Charles V were baffled by the artillery of the United Provinces. The barons of Richard easily dispersed the rabble who followed the standard of Wat Tyler, but the musketry of English yeomanry overthrew the squadrons of the Norman nobility at Marston Moor. The firearms are the greatest of all levellers. Like the hand of death, they prostrate equally the ranks of the poor and the array of princes. Wealth soon became essential to the prosecution of war, from the costly impediments which were brought into the field. Industry, indispensable to success, from the rapid consummation of the interests of destruction, which attended the continuance of the contest. By this momentous change, new elements were brought into action, which completely altered the relative situations of the contending parties. Industry ceased to be defenceless, because it could purchase the means of protection. Violence lost its ascendancy, because it withered the sinews by which its forces were to be maintained. The introduction of artificial wants and the progress of luxury completed the destruction of feudal power. When the elegancies of life were comparatively unknown, and the barons lived in rural magnificence on their estates, the distribution of their wealth kept a multitude of retainers round their castles, who were always ready to support the authority from which they derived their subsistence. But by degrees the progress of opulence brought the nobility to the metropolis, while the increase of luxury augmented their expenses. From that moment their ascendancy was at an end. When the landed proprietor squandered his wealth in the indulgence of artificial desires, and seldom visited the halls of his ancestors but to practice extortion upon his tenantry, his means of maintaining war were dissipated, and the influence he possessed over his people was destroyed. Interest ceased to be a bond of union, when no reciprocity of mutual services existed. Affection gradually expired from the absence of the objects on which it was to be exerted. Debt contracted to satisfy the cravings of urban desires, became overwhelming. Embarrassments either led to the alienation of estates or the insolvency of their possessors. The new purchasers had no historic names or ancient influence to back their fortunes. Newly transplanted into the soil, they required several generations to overshadow it by their expansion. Such recent proprietors form an important element in the balance of political power, and as they speedily imbibe the feelings from being actuated by the interests of the landed aristocracy, they are of great consequence in steadying the movements of the social body, but they are scarcely ever formidable to the general liberty. The old families are too jealous of their wealth to permit of any dangerous union being formed between them. The mass of people have not been so long trained to respect as now to fear them. The power of the feudal nobility was long the object of apprehension, after its real influence had been dissolved, from the remembrance of its terrors in former times. The importance of this change, like that of all others introduced by nature, was not perceived till its effects were manifested. The aristocracy of France was still the object of antiquated dread when it stood on the brink of destruction, and the people were doubtful of their ability to resist its power when it sank without a struggle before the violence of its enemies. From the revival of letters in the commencement of the 16th century and the dawn of the Reformation, these causes had been silently operating, and time, greatest of all innovators, was gradually changing the face of the moral world. The stubborn valour of the reformed religion had emancipated an industrious people from the yoke of Spain, and the stern fanaticism of the English Puritans had overthrown the power of the Norman nobility. The extension of knowledge had shaken the foundations of arbitrary power, and public opinion, even in the least enlightened countries, moderated the force of despotic sway. The worst governed states in Europe were constitutional monarchies compared to the dynasties of the East, and the oppression even of Russian severity was light in comparison of the cruelties of the Roman emperors. But it was not till the commencement of the French Revolution that the extent of the changes which had occurred was perceived, and the weaknesses of the arms of despotism felt, when brought into collision with the efforts of freedom. Standing armies had been considered as the most fatal discovery of sovereigns, and the history of former ages appealed to, as illustrating their tendency to establish despotic authority. But the changes of time were wresting from the hands of tyranny even this dreaded weapon, and in the next convulsion it destroyed the power which had created it. The sagacity of the French monarchs had trained up these formidable bands as counterpoise to the power of aristocracy, and they had rendered the crown independent of the control of feudal barons. But a greater wisdom than that of Richelieu was preparing, in their power and discipline, the means of a total change of society. In vain the unfortunate Louis surmounted his armies to the capital, and appealed to their chivalrous feelings against the violence of the people. The spirit of democracy had penetrated even the ranks of the veteran soldiers, and, with the revolt of the Guards, the French monarchy was destroyed. It is this circumstance which has created so important a distinction between the progress of popular power in recent and its fate in ancient times. Tyranny has everywhere prevailed in former times by arming one portion of the people against the other, and its chief reliance has hitherto been placed on the troops, whose interests were identified with its support. But the progress of information has destroyed, in these countries where it is fully established, the security of despotism, by dividing the affections of the armies on which it depends. And the sovereigns of the military monarchies in Europe have now often more to fear from the troops whom they have formed to be the instruments of their will, than from the citizens whom they regard as the objects of apprehension. The translation of the sword from the nobility to the throne, so long the subject of regret to the friends of freedom, has thus become an important step in the emancipation of mankind. War, amidst all its horrors, has contributed to the communication of knowledge and the dispelling of prejudice, and power has ceased to be unassailable, because it has been transferred from a body whose interests are permanent to one whose attachments yield to the changes of society. Yet is this last and greatest shake given to the powers of despotism, not unaccompanied with evil. On the contrary, it often produces calamities greater even than those it was intended to remove. Military caprice becomes irresistible when military subordination is overthrown. The foundations of government are laid in the quicksands of the fortunes of the soldiers' favour. The Praetorian bands of the capital became the rules of the state. It is but a poor exchange which a nation makes, which throws off the regular government of hereditary property to incur the arbitrary rule of the sword. The soldiers who betray their oaths to induce the change are the worst pioneers of despotism. The former history of the world is chiefly occupied with the struggles of freedom against bondage, the efforts of laborious industry to emancipate itself from the yoke of aristocratic power. Our sympathies are all with the oppressed. Our fears are lest the pristine servitude of the species should be re-established. But with the rise of the French Revolution, a new set of perils has been developed, and the historian finds himself overwhelmed with the constant survey of the terrible evils of democratic oppression. The causes which have been mentioned have at length given such an extraordinary and irresistible weight to the popular party that the danger now sets in from another quarter, and the tyranny which is to be apprehended is often not that of the few over the many, but of the many over the few. The obvious risk now is, in all states with a popular form of government, that the influence of knowledge, virtue, and worth will be overwhelmed in the vehemence of popular ambition, or lost in the turbulence of democratic power. This evil is of a far more acute and terrible kind than the severity of regal or the weight of aristocratic oppression. In a few years, when fully developed, it destroys the whole frame of society, and extinguishes the very elements of freedom, by annihilating the classes whose intermixture is essential to its existence. Excuse my stuttering. By annihilating the classes whose intermixture is essential to its existence. It is beneath this fiery torrent that the civilized world is now passing, and all the efforts of philosophy are therefore required to observe its course and mitigate its devastation. Happy if the historian can find in the record of past suffering aught to justify future hope, or in the errors of former inexperience the lesson of subsequent wisdom. It is by slow degrees and imperceptible additions that the great changes of nature are accomplished. Vegetation, commencing with lichens, swells to the riches and luxuriance of the forest. Continents, the seat of empires and the abode of millions, are formed from the deposits of innumerable rills. Animal life, springing from the torpid vitality of shellfish, rises to the energy and power of man. It is by similar steps, and as slow a progress, that the great fabric of society is formed. Regulated liberty, the greatest of human blessings, the chief spring of human improvement, is of the most tardy development. Ages elapse before it acquires consistency. Nations disappear during the contest for its establishment. The continued observation of this important truth is fitted both to inspire hope and encourage moderation. Hope, by showing how unceasing has been the progress of improvement through all the revolutions of the world. Moderation, by demonstrating how vain and dangerous are all attempts to outstrip the march of nature, or confer upon one age the institutions or habits of another. The annals of the great French Revolution, more than any other event in human affairs, are calculated to demonstrate these important truths, and by evincing in equally striking colours the irresistible growth of liberty and the terrible evils of precipitate innovation, to impress moderation upon the rulers and caution upon the agitators of mankind, and thus sever from the future progress of freedom those bloody triumphs by which its past history has been stained. Well, thank you for listening to that episode. I'm sorry that I read so poorly today. That's the introduction done, so next week will be chapter 1, and thank you. Have a good one.